Hey guys, welcome to my fourth and final video for my Abbadon the Spoiler painting series. This whole project has been a massive learning experience for me, and it took a lot of time, but he turned out looking absolutely epic, and I'm glad that I pushed through to the end. In this video, I'm going to walk you through my process for painting the Talon of Horus, Drach'nyen, his war trophies, his cape, and the base. Let's get into it. Starting out with the Talon of Horus, I wanted to keep it relatively simple here. I went for a basic steel, non-metallic metal color using black and white for the talons, but before I jumped into painting the talons, I started with the palm. For the palm, I wanted to replicate the color scheme that I had for the armor, which involves stippling on a light purple color and then washing the area with a watered down Abbadon black to darken the shadows. This area was heavily textured, so I just used the edge of my brush to catch all of the raised edges for the highlights. Now for the talons, for these I added a series of layers that got progressively brighter. I was just using black and white here and then adding more and more white with each layer. For the placements of the highlights, I was focusing on the areas that would catch light as if the light were coming from his upper left side. With each layer, I covered less and less surface area of the claws, and I was using a glaze consistency paint here to try and smooth the transitions as best as I could. At this point, I'm painting on the second layer and I'm applying it to his left side of each claw. And the reason for this is because in my mind, that's where the light is hitting the model. I'm not painting the other side of that portion so it remains dark. This is going to create nice contrast and make the claws look a little bit more metal. Now on this next layer, I'm adding a little bit more white to brighten it up, and I'm just painting these same areas to brighten up these sections. And I'm using glaze consistency paints again to make sure I have some smooth transitions between these layers. As I got closer and closer to pure white, I started to focus more on edge highlighting each of the talons. Now, why is the Talon of Horus so cool? Well, it's because it was originally Horus's weapon and most likely used in the final duel with the Emperor. So this model here has arguably one of the most important weapons in all of the 40k canon, which makes Abbadon pretty cool. Now I have two more layers at this point, this light gray color and then pure white, and then I repeated the same process on the bolter on his claw. And that wraps up painting this area. It wasn't too difficult. I think painting in grayscale gave me an opportunity to really focus on value, so I think it was a good learning experience. For the final touches on the Talon of Horus, I had to paint the brass sections, and that includes this skull looking thing on the side of the bolter and the bullets. So the colors for this, I used a dark brown, whole red. This is a reddish brown color. I used this as the base coat, and then I progressed to a brown ochre color, and then eventually to a brighter ochre that I got by mixing white and brown ochre. For these layers, I'm using a very light touch and I'm progressing gradually by mixing more and more brown ochre. You can see here in the clip that some of the features of the skull and the bullets are starting to pop out as I add some brighter highlights. And with this final highlight here, that is the last step to painting the Talon of Horus. This process was really simple, and I tried to keep it simple on purpose so I could just focus on painting value. Now to paint Drach'nyen, the End of Empires, and this thing was a pain in the butt to paint. I wanted something that looked like the box art because I really liked how the blue color looked against the black, red, and gold. And to get that blue color for the blade, I used black, Macragge blue, Baroth blue, and white. And then for the demon face handle, I used a whole red color for the base coat, and then I used orange, red, and buff for the highlights. I started off by blocking in the colors. For the handle, I mixed brown with black to create a very dark brown, and then for the blade, I used a very dark blue by mixing Macragge blue and black. I wanted these colors to be dark, as they will be the color for the darkest shadows on the sword. For the highlights, I started with the hilt, and I'm using orange first. Now, I'm not just jumping straight into orange. I'm mixing orange with whole red to create a transition color, and this is going to be my first layer that I apply to all of the edges and spikes and facial features on the hilt. The origin of Drach'nyen in the lore is pretty interesting. Drach'nyen is actually a demon that was born when the first human willingly murdered another human. kind of like Cain and Abel from the Bible. But essentially, that evil from the first murder planted the original seed that eventually grew into Drach'nyen as more humans murdered each other throughout time. This sword is basically the embodiment of wrath. Well, anyways, after that layer, I added a thin layer of red here to add a little bit of a reddish hue to this hilt. And can I just say, I love the face on this hilt. It looks like 80s Warhammer art. Now, after this layer, I jumped straight into my pure orange and then highlighted those same edge sections. And you can see here how thin the paint is. I don't want a super thick paint, that way I can apply this gradually. And I want that red and brown to kind of show underneath this orange layer. For the final highlight, I mixed in buff with my orange color to create a very bright skin tone, peachy orange type color. And then I used this to edge highlight the hilt. Now this color is pretty different than orange. It's not just a bright red or bright orange, it's more of a tan color. And I think because of that, it really makes the edges on this section pop. And I think it looks pretty cool. And now it is time to focus on the blade, which turned out to be really difficult and challenging because of all of the little faces in the sword. Now, the first thing I did though was I took pure Macragge blue and I started sketching out all of these sections I wanted on the sword to be highlighted. So for me, that was towards the tip and then towards the base, kind of in this downwards diagonal motion. To brighten up these sections, I mixed in Baroth blue with my Macragge blue to create a transition color and then applied this to these same areas, covering a smaller surface area. Now when painting this layer, I started to realize that I needed to paint the faces white before I move up further in color, because it's going to be difficult to paint these faces accurately because they're so small. So I just took white and put this in all the faces, and it was pretty messy and I had to use many thin layers, and this was a very frustrating step. So I would recommend base coating the sword white and then adding your blue on top of that so that you can leave the faces white. I think that would be a much easier approach. Now, when I was painting the faces, because it was kind of difficult to get the white accurately into the faces, there was a lot of spillover. So I went back to my dark blue color and I started glazing over these sections to darken or paint over the white spillover. You can see that it's looking really shoddy at this point, and there was a couple times during this step in the process where I was thinking about just dunking the sword in isopropyl and starting over, but I'm glad that I stuck it out. After finishing up those steps, this is what the sword looked like. It was basically just dark blue with the faces painted bright white. Now, after this, I had to re-sketch my highlights on, so I went back to that Baroth blue, mixed it with Macragge blue to get the mid-tone, and then re-layered on that color to create the highlights. Now, if you notice here, I'm using the brush to push the pigments in the direction I want the sword to be the brightest. When I'm painting this layer, I'm trying to avoid painting the faces. So the easiest way that I found to do this was to use the side of my brush and just glaze over top of these sections. The next couple steps just involved me working with glaze consistency paints and smoothing the transitions between light areas and dark areas. Now, painting like this was new to me. I think of it as a reverse highlight. So generally, the light source is projected onto the model externally. However, in this case, the light source is on the model itself. In this case, it's the faces on the sword. So to create a glow effect, they need to be brighter than the lightest highlight on the sword blade. This is going to create a kind of glow effect on the sword with the faces seeming to be the source of that glow. That's why I went back and painted the faces white. I used about 4 to 5 different layers of paint during this step, and I was very focused on getting those smooth transitions. I wanted to get the sword into a good spot before moving on to my high highlights for the sword blade. It took some time, but I think it was a good learning experience and will help me with other models that I paint. After getting the sword in a good spot, I moved on to my highest highlights by adding in white to Baroth blue. An important thing here is that I did not go all the way to pure white because the faces on the sword themselves are pure white, and I want those to be the brightest. This was all done with a glaze consistency paint, and I was constantly pushing the pigment toward the brightest section on the model. I also did a lot of edge highlighting here. For the last highlight, I mixed in a little bit more white to brighten the mixture and painted this sparingly on the sword. I focused here on edge highlighting and made sure to trace each face as best I could to help create that glow effect. Now, the nice thing about this sword is that if you can paint Drach'nyen well, I think you can pretty much paint any sword well because the sword has a lot of texture. It has those individual faces on it, and they make it a little bit challenging to get these smooth gradients because you're trying to use glaze consistency paints and you're constantly having to paint over these white faces, and it makes it a little bit challenging. And that wraps up painting the sword. Now, of course, I went back and did some touch-ups. Now, what I'm doing here is I'm using pure white with a very small needle brush and painting this white into the faces. And then after this, I went back to my dark blue and darkened my shadows. And the goal here was to increase the contrast between the dark and the light to really sell the glow effect. But overall, this was a really fun sword to paint. And now it's time to paint his war trophies. So he's got skulls and a Blood Angel's helmet here, and I started with the skulls. So for the first base coat, I used a lightened reddish brown color. All I did was mix brown with whole red, and it created this kind of purpley looking brown, and I used this as a base coat. Now in the past, I've always used base coat and washes to paint skulls, but this time I wanted to try just pure layering. So what I did after that base coat was I just lightened the brown with some more white and then layered that over top of the previous layer to create some highlights. Now you can see how thin my paint here is, and there's two reasons for that. Is that number one, I've noticed if you paint on thick layers of white, it can turn out kind of chalky when it dries. And number two is that by using a thin layer of paint, the paint is going to dry closer to the base color because essentially the color before it is going to show through the layer you put on because it's so thin. And because of that, this is allowing me to build up this white layer by layer, and this creates smooth transitions and ultimately creates some nice looking skulls. Now for the helmet, I ultimately decided on a Blood Angel's helmet, and I wanted it to look really epic, so I started with a very dark red, and the reason for that was so that I could create some nice contrast between the shadows on the helmet and the bright sections on the helmet. When I paint on the second layer, you can see just how much brighter it is than the dark base coat, and it turned out really good with only two layers. And I think I didn't want to push the color brighter than this because when you start brightening red, it can turn orange or yellow. But since it's a Blood Angel, I wanted it to be a true red color, and it turned out looking really good. This is making me want to paint some Blood Angels. And now it's time to paint the cape, and I started with the inside. The first layer I did was just a pure base coat of whole red. It was simple as possible. And after I base coated this with pure red, I then thinned down some Abbadon black and glazed this into all of the shadows or all of the recesses on the inside of the cape. And the reason why I'm painting the inside first is that the idea here is to paint this and then glue it on the model, so then I can paint the outside of the cape. And the reason why I'm doing that is so that I can have an easier time visualizing where the highlight should go on the outside of the cape. After glazing in the shadows, I mixed in red with my brown color and then glazed the raised areas on the cape. I'm always pushing the paint towards the section I want to be the brightest here, and I'm going for smooth transitions, and this created a nice looking base for me to add some highlights. I wanted the inside of the cape to have an orange leather look, so I mixed in orange with my whole red to create a orangey brown color. You can see the paint consistency here, and then I glazed this on the raised areas and edge highlighted the edges of the cape. Now the idea here was to just get a nice base down. This is not my final highlight. After painting this layer, I then glued the cape onto the model. For the record, gluing the cape on this model was a little bit tricky and it covered a lot of that metallic trim, but that's okay because it looks really cool. Now for the first layer here, I took buff, which is a very bright desaturated yellow color, mixed that into my orangey brown color, and I used this to edge highlight the cape and add some additional highlights to the most raised sections on the inside of the cape. For the final highlight, I mixed in buff red and my orangey brown color to create a very light peach color, and I used this to edge highlight the cape and then add some scratches to the most raised areas. Like textures, like scratches on the cape. After finishing up the inside of the cape, it was time to move on to the back of the cape, and I wanted it to be gray. Now, the gray I used was a mixture of buff and black, and this created, I think, more of a tan gray, but it's really subtle. But on this first layer, I just used this to edge highlight the raised areas of the cape. And again, I'm using glaze consistency paints here and trying to create smooth transitions from black to the light areas on the cape. Something about painting capes that I learned from this project is that they are fantastic surface areas to practice your glazing on because they're long and smooth. So you can take your glaze consistency paint and really work on getting those long, smooth transitions between the dark areas and the light areas. For the brighter highlights, I ended up mixing in white into the mixture because if I had just continued to add in buff, it would have turned really yellow, which is not something that I wanted for the back of the cape. And then I used this brighter color to just edge highlight the entire cape and then add some additional glaze highlights to the raised areas on the folds of the capes. After this, it was just a matter of refining the transitions between the dark areas and the light areas. I didn't want to push the highlights too high because then they may have turned out brighter than the metallic trim, which wouldn't really make sense because the cape is leather. You can see here that I went back and forth between my darkest black and my lightest color and constantly used a paint consistency that was thin enough to show the layers underneath it. This is what enabled me to build those smooth transitions. For the fur, I kept it super simple. All I did was base coat it gray and then dry brush buff over top of the fur, and this made it look a little bit tan, which is what I was going for. And now it's time to paint the base and the first Space Marine on this channel.
Die, heretics!
Well, anyways, the first thing I did was I wanted to add some additional texture to the base, so I just added some PVA glue around the edge area that you see here and some additional spots on the main area of the base. Then I dunked this in sand and sprinkled it all over the base, and this is going to add that additional gravel-like texture or dirt-like texture that I was going for. While the glue was still drying, I took some apple barrel paint, watered it down, and dabbed it onto the sand. The idea here is that the paint is watery enough to seep into all the cracks, and once it dries, it will act as a sealant along with the glue to hold the sand in place. I let this dry overnight, and then in the next morning, I took light blue and dry brushed this onto the sand to bring out all of the texture. This was a very simple way to do a nice looking black textured base. I also used some time here to paint the skulls. I just used the same method that I used to paint the skulls on his trophy rack. Now for the Space Marine, I went with a classic Ultramarine Captain, and the first layer was a very dark layer of McCrag blue. I just mixed in the blue with black to create something slightly darker than the base McCrag blue color. For the highlight layer, I just took pure McCrag blue and painted this on some of the more raised sections over the main surface areas of the Space Marine. This was a pretty simple process, mostly just two-step, and it didn't take that long, and it turned out really good. After this, I painted the trim using Balthasar Gold, and guys, painting Space Marine trim is a literal dream. It is so easy, straight and uniform. There's no spikes or weird things coming out of it. I enjoyed this process, and it made me really seriously consider getting some Space Marines. For the final highlight, I just mixed in Barroth Blue and McCrag Blue and used this to edge highlight the armor. Now, I wanted this guy to be a Space Marine captain, so I had to draw on the red stripe and then the tiny white stripes on his head, which was pretty difficult, but it was fun, and it turned out looking pretty nice. And there we go. There's one ultramarine right there. After finishing up the Space Marine, I then painted the metal wing the same way that I painted the non-metallic metal trim. The process basically involved base coating with a dark brown and then progressing all the way up to a light yellow color layer by layer. If you want to see a more detailed process on this approach, check out my video on painting Abbadon's gold trim. After finishing up the wing, I then took a stab at painting the torch, which I ended up changing down the road. And then I dry brushed a little bit of orange on the wing as well to try to create a little bit of a glow effect that's coming from the torch. After doing all of that, it was now time for the moment of truth. Nice. And that's Abbadon, the despoiler. Of course, I went back over the model, I touched up parts of his cape, hair, and repainted the torch. Overall, this was a long but enjoyable process, and I learned a massive amount working through this. Am I going to paint every model this way? Most likely not, but I've found it very rewarding to put a lot of time in a single model, and now I have an awesome looking Abbadon to add to my collection. If you watched all 4 of my videos on Abbadon, thanks for tuning in. As always, I hope that you're encouraged by this video to go and paint your own awesome looking miniatures. Subscribe if you want to see more of my videos, and I hope to catch you in the comment section.